Dawn crept slowly over the jagged Afghan mountains, brushing the sky with the faintest shade of pale gold. But inside the British cantonment outside Kabul, there was no warmth in that light. The snow had fallen through the night, thick and heavy, swallowing tents, pathways, and broken fences under a cold, silent blanket. It muffled every sound, as if the world itself wanted to hide what had happened here. Soldiers moved like ghosts between the drifts, wrapped in thin coats that did nothing against the bite of the January wind. Their boots crunched softly, each step echoing in a camp where confidence had once marched proudly, and now only fear remained. Just a few months earlier, this same ground had been filled with music, laughter, and the loud certainty of empire. British officers rode their horses through the bazaars of Kabul as if they owned the city. They believed the local tribes would bow, the king they installed would rule quietly, and the mountains would stand harmless in the distance. But mountains do not bow. Not here. Not ever. And as winter settled over the Kabul plain, it carried whispers. Angry voices gathering strength in shadowed valleys, old resentments rising from the dust. The British had expected obedience. What they got instead was a storm. The cantonment itself reflected that broken arrogance. It had been built far from defensible ground, its walls weak, its supplies low, its design more suited for comfort than survival. Large, open areas exposed every movement. Inside the snowy compound, officers passed each other with tight jaws and lowered eyes. Their once crisp uniforms were stained with smoke and dirt. In the corners of the camp, wounded soldiers huddled beneath torn blankets, their breaths hanging in the air like fading ghosts. Every crack in the wood, every unfinished trench, every poorly guarded gate felt like a warning finally understood too late. Near the remains of a collapsed barracks, a group of sepoys warmed their hands over a small fire, speaking in low voices. One of them, younger than the rest, kept glancing nervously toward the hills. "They're out there," he whispered, "watching." None of the others argued. They all knew he was right. Afghan fighters had been seen on the ridges for days, silhouettes flickering like shadows just beyond reach. They did not attack, not yet, but their presence pressed down on the camp like a weight on the chest. Every soldier, every officer, every servant inside the cantonment felt it. At headquarters, the mood was darker still. Inside a dim tent, lit only by a single oil lamp, British commanders studied maps with trembling fingers. The lines and markings that once promised control now looked more like a trap. Rumors had already swept through the camp that Kabul was slipping from their grasp. Local chiefs were turning against them. Their puppet king, Shah Shuja, was losing support by the hour. The city had become a simmering pot, waiting for the moment to boil over. The officers spoke in hushed tones, their faces drawn and sleepless. Some argued they could hold the cantonment if they fortified it. Others whispered that they should retreat before the passes closed completely from snow. But none could hide the truth lurking behind their eyes. They no longer ruled Kabul. Kabul ruled them. Outside that tent, fear crept like frost into every crack of the camp's foundation. Supplies were shrinking. Food barely stretched through the day. Men tore their rations in half, saving whatever scraps they could. Horses, once proud animals of officers, stood thin and shivering, their ribs showing through patchy fur. Even the wind seemed crueler lately, cutting through cloth and skin with the sharpness of a blade. Some soldiers swore they heard distant drums at night. Others claimed they saw torches moving along the foothills. Whether real or imagined, it didn't matter. Panic thrives on silence, and the winter of 1842 gave them plenty of it. From time to time, an officer would try to reassure the men, telling them the situation was under control, but their voices lacked conviction. They sounded like men speaking lines they no longer believed. The troops noticed. They always do. And when soldiers lose faith in their leaders, the ground beneath them begins to crack. Many wondered quietly, how did an empire so powerful end up trapped in a freezing valley, surrounded by enemies it never bothered to understand? Why had no one prepared for winter? Why had they built their camp away from the city walls? Why did command treat Afghan politics like a puzzle they could solve with coins and threats? The questions lingered like ghosts in the icy air. Late in the afternoon, the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows that reached into the camp like dark, searching fingers. The temperature dropped quickly. Fires were lit, but even flames seemed weak against the wind that howled through the cantonment. Smoke curled upward, twisting like torn memories of better days. Somewhere in the distance, a single gunshot cracked the quiet. A sentry shouted. Men rushed toward the sound, rifles in hand. But by the time they reached the outer wall, the mountains were silent again. Only footprints in the snow remained, small, quick, and leading back toward the hills. Another warning. The officers called the men back, but their voices shook. Night settled in like a heavy blanket. The stars above Kabul were sharp and cold, glittering like frozen shards of glass. In the barracks, soldiers lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling. Some thought of home, the soft fields of England, the warm breezes of India. Others prayed quietly, their breaths fogging the cold air. A few cried silently, the tears freezing on their cheeks before anyone could see. No one said it aloud, but they all felt the same truth rising inside them. Something terrible was coming. And yet, in the center of the camp, a different kind of quiet formed. The quiet of men who sensed the end of something they once thought unbreakable. The British Empire had marched into Afghanistan with banners raised high, claiming it would bring order and stability. But you cannot force a land to obey a map. You cannot hold a mountain by the throat. And when pride blinds you, even a snowflake becomes a warning. As midnight approached, the wind carried with it a faint echo, the distant, mournful cry of someone calling out in the dark. It rose, wavered, and faded into the cold silence. No one knew if it belonged to an Afghan fighter, a spy, or a dying soldier lost in the snow. But it pierced the hearts of those who heard it. In that moment, even the bravest felt the thin edge of fear press against their ribs. By morning, more tracks appeared near the outer wall. A message was delivered from Afghan leaders. Demands, warnings, threats folded neatly inside formal words. The officers' faces tightened. Arguments broke out again. Some wanted to negotiate. Others wanted to strike first. A few finally admitted what none had dared to say. They were losing Kabul by the hour. Around them, the snow kept falling, quiet, patient, and indifferent. Nature itself seemed to echo the truth. Winter had come, and it would not leave soon. And so, the seeds of disaster settled quietly across the cantonment, buried beneath heavy drifts of white. No battle had begun yet, no gunfire filled the air, no columns were marching. But the ending had already started. It hid in the distrust between officers, in the empty supply wagons, in the distant figures watching from the mountains. It lived inside the cold breath of every man who woke that morning and saw the world covered in snow. The retreat from Kabul had not begun, but it had already been written. Morning rose weakly over Kabul, its pale light filtering through a sky thick with winter haze. The mountains surrounding the city stood silent and watchful, their peaks dusted with snow like crowns carved from ice. Below them, the fragile kingdom the British had stitched together began to tremble. It was a kingdom built on promises that did not belong to the land, held up by men who did not trust one another, and ruled by a king who wore a crown heavy with doubt. And as the winter of 1842 deepened, the cracks in this fragile creation widened with every passing day. The British had placed Shah Shuja on Afghanistan's throne with the belief that he would secure loyalty, stability, and obedience. But a king chosen by foreigners carries a shadow behind him, and the Afghan people saw that shadow clearly. To the tribes, he was not a leader born from their mountains or their bloodlines. He was a puppet, a symbol of humiliation. The British thought gold and threats would keep the tribes quiet. But Afghan pride is not something that bends easily. It bends only when it chooses to, and in those months it bent for no one. Across Kabul, resentment simmered like a kettle left on the fire too long. In the narrow alleys of the old city, shopkeepers whispered to each other behind closed doors. In the dark corners of tea houses, men gathered in tight circles, voices low, eyes sharp. In the villages beyond the city walls, Tribal elders passed messages by firelight, carried from valley to valley on horseback. The words were simple but heavy. The time is coming. Yet inside the British cantonment, those whispers were treated as nothing more than wind. Officers assured themselves that the Afghans were too divided, too disorganized to rise against them. They believed their empire's presence alone was enough to keep rebellion at bay. But the land had already begun to shift beneath their feet. Afghanistan had been quiet, not because it was controlled, but because it was waiting. Shah Shuja felt it first. Every time he stepped from his palace, he sensed the angry stares watching him from doorways and rooftops. His guards tightened their grips on their weapons, their eyes scanning the crowds. The king's once bright confidence had dimmed, replaced with a growing awareness that the throne beneath him was made of ice. Solid on the surface, but thin and cracking underneath. Even his courtiers whispered behind his back, wondering how long he could last once the first spark lit the flames. From the hills overlooking Kabul, Afghan tribes gathered to observe the capital with quiet intensity. The Ghilzais, the Kohistanis, the men of Logar and Wardak, each tribe carried its own history of pride and war. But now, for the first time in years, their rivalries faded. The mountains themselves seemed to call them toward unity. A common enemy had given old opponents a single purpose. And in their gatherings, by the cold glow of nighttime fires, rebellion was no longer a dream. It was a breathing, growing force. The British sensed something was wrong, but not enough to act with urgency. Reports arrived from tribal regions. Caravans attacked, messengers vanished, supplies stolen. Instead of seeing these signs as warnings, commanders brushed them aside. They called them isolated incidents, blaming bandits or rogue fighters. To London, thousands of miles away, Afghanistan was just a distant chessboard. They believed their pieces were still in place. They didn't realize the board itself was shaking. In the cantonment, fear and frustration fed on each other. Afghan workers who once served the British began to quit quietly. Some vanished into the mountains. Others stayed only long enough to pass information to rebel leaders. Trust evaporated. At night, soldiers watched from guard towers, scanning the black horizon for movement. Every flicker of light, every shadow on the hillside, made their hearts pound. Rumors spread like frost, of villages preparing to rise, of chiefs who had sworn blood oaths, of a storm gathering beyond the reach of British control. Even small signs became heavy with meaning. A caravan of supplies arrived late without explanation. Several officers were denied entry into parts of the bazaar that had once welcomed them with smiles. A tribal leader who once bowed politely now refused to attend a meeting. These were small things, but in a land ruled by pride and memory, small things were warnings carved in stone. One afternoon, a British patrol rode out toward a nearby village. The sky was gray, and a cold wind swept across the valley. When they reached the outskirts of the village, it seemed deserted. Doors were shut. No children played outside. No smoke rose from chimneys. The silence felt unnatural, wrong. One of the soldiers whispered, "They knew we were coming." When the patrol returned to the cantonment, their faces were pale. They told their commander that the village had been emptied before they arrived. Not out of fear, but out of strategy. Afghanistan was pulling back, preparing. Meanwhile, Shah Shuja sent message after message to British officials, warning them that the people were turning against him. He begged for stronger defenses, more troops, more support. But the British believed the situation was manageable. They believed their control was still firm. They believed they had time. They were wrong. Rebellion does not announce itself with trumpets. It begins as a whisper, then a murmur, then a low rumble rolling through mountains and valleys. By late November, that rumble had become impossible to ignore. Tribal riders were seen gathering near the passes. Messengers carried sealed letters through narrow mountain paths. Weapons were traded in secret. Men practiced firing muskets under the cover of darkness. Kabul was a city waiting to explode. And yet, inside the British quarters, an eerie calm remained. Not the calm of safety, but the calm right before lightning strikes. Officers held dinners and formal meetings, trying to keep up the illusion of control. But beneath their polished boots and table conversations, anxiety simmered. They felt the shift. They felt the air grow tighter. They heard the distant echoes of movement they could not see. But pride kept them still. Pride, the most dangerous enemy of all. By early December, the final layer of fragile peace cracked. Storehouses were looted. Afghan soldiers in the British-trained ranks began deserting in the night. Shah Shuja's influence shrank to a circle so small it barely reached beyond his palace walls. The British tried to send envoys to tribal chiefs, offering gold and promises. But those offers returned with cold silence or did not return at all. The kingdom they had built was collapsing not with a roar, but with the quiet, unstoppable pressure of a people reclaiming what was theirs. Afghanistan had waited long enough, and now the storm was almost ready to break. In the mountains above Kabul, as snow curled through the air, a tribal leader looked down at the city and whispered to the men beside him, "Soon." Below him, Kabul lay still, unaware that within days, everything would burn. The British believed they still ruled a kingdom. They were wrong. They were standing inside a fuse, seconds before the flame reached its end. Night fell over Kabul like a velvet shroud, muffling the city under a blanket of cold and silence. Lanterns flickered in the cantonment, their light pale against the deep shadows cast by high walls and narrow streets. Snow had settled in drifts along rooftops, hiding the footprints of those who moved with purpose through the darkness. Inside the British quarters, soldiers huddled around small fires, rubbing numb hands and sharing hushed words of worry. Officers sat in their tents, maps spread before them, arguing again about tribal loyalty, about supplies, about escape routes. They believed the city still obeyed them. They believed they were safe. And then, in a single instant, all of that certainty shattered. The spark came quietly, like a whisper first carried on the wind. Lieutenant Henry Martin, a young officer barely 25, rode through the streets on a routine patrol. The night was still, the snow silent, and for a moment he thought he might reach the edge of the city unobserved. Then a shot rang out, sudden, deafening against the frozen air. Martin fell from his horse, the crimson spreading across the white snow as if the mountains themselves had been cut open. Men in nearby houses bolted doors, torches flared, and the first flickers of panic rippled through the cantonment. The British realized with dawning horror that Kabul was no longer under their control. News of Martin's death traveled quickly. Officers convened hastily, faces pale, breaths short, hands trembling over pistols and sabers. Word spread that other British soldiers were being attacked in separate parts of the city, that messengers had been cut down, that barricades had been overrun. In the narrow streets of Kabul, fires began to blaze. Small at first, lighting windows and alleys, then swelling as torches were tossed, haystacks ignited, and entire homes burned. Smoke curled into the sky, black and acrid, choking the stars. The city was awake now, and it was angry. Afghan fighters emerged from the shadows, moving with precision and familiarity. They struck from rooftops, from hidden courtyards, from the alleys that British troops had ignored for weeks. Every column of soldiers met with sudden fire. Every street they tried to secure twisted into a maze of death. Shouts echoed through the snow, blending with the crack of musket fire and the roar of horses spooked by gunshots. The cantonment gates were stormed in several locations, and for the first time, British soldiers understood the scale of the betrayal. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and trapped inside a city that had once welcomed them. Inside the headquarters tent, panic began to infect even the commanders. Letters from Shah Shuja reported attacks on his own palace guards. Caravans carrying supplies were missing, looted, or destroyed. Communication with distant outposts was cut off. Officers argued, voices raised above the cries outside, but their words were lost in the chaos. Fear had replaced discipline. Courage became a memory. Each man realized that the carefully constructed rules of engagement, the maps and strategies, meant nothing here. Kabul had chosen to rise, and the British were caught in the center. Soldiers ran through snow-laden streets, dragging wounded comrades, trying desperately to hold positions that seemed impossible to defend. Families huddled in the corners of houses, their screams echoing through the chaos. The once proud cantonment, carefully fortified, now resembled a fragile cage being torn apart. Every window was a threat, every doorway a danger, and every shadow could hide a rifle aimed at a British chest. In those first hours of rebellion, the city became a living predator, hunting those who had thought themselves masters of its streets. And yet, the British attempted to respond. Cannon fire shook the narrow streets, musket volleys rang out, and officers tried to rally troops into formations. But coordination was impossible. Units were separated by snow, smoke, and sheer panic. Soldiers froze, confused by the sudden attack, slipping on icy pavements, lost among the twists of Kabul's alleys. Men who had laughed together in the warmth of mess halls just nights before now stumbled over each other, driven only by the primal need to survive. Orders were shouted, often unheard, often ignored. And with each passing minute, the city tightened its grip, making escape feel increasingly unattainable. Fires spread from street to street. Roofs collapsed under the heat, sending plumes of sparks into the night sky. Smoke filled the cantonment, mixing with the cold mist of the mountains to create an oppressive, choking haze. British soldiers, once proud and disciplined, now moved with a desperate determination born of fear. Each step was a gamble, each turn of a corner a possible death sentence. The city was no longer a place of occupation. It was a battlefield shaped by the knowledge, cunning, and anger of those who had lived there for generations. By midnight, the revolt had engulfed Kabul. Shouts, gunfire, and the groans of the dying formed a grim symphony. The British had misjudged the patience and unity of the tribes. The puppet king's forces offered little resistance, deserting or hiding as the violence escalated. Every street corner told a story of betrayal. Every shattered window reflected the terror of soldiers and civilians alike. The snow, once pristine, was stained with blood, scattered belongings, and broken lives. The revolt had ignited fully, and there was no turning back. The officers inside the cantonment knew they faced a choice: fight to the last man, or retreat through a city they no longer understood. But that choice came too late. Afghans controlled the rooftops, the streets, and the mountains surrounding the city. Reinforcements from distant posts could not arrive in time. Panic spread faster than fire, infecting every heart with the realization that the British had miscalculated Kabul's spirit. The city had risen not as an accident, but as a carefully orchestrated expression of centuries of pride, memory, and anger. In one small courtyard, a soldier tried to protect a group of camp followers, dragging women and children through icy snow while bullets ricocheted off walls around him. His eyes were wide with terror. His hands shook as he clutched a musket he barely knew how to use. Nearby, another man stumbled over the body of a fellow soldier, slipping in the blood-slick snow, unable to rise. These were the first human echoes of what would soon become a full-scale tragedy. Survival was no longer guaranteed. Every heartbeat was a test of fate. By the early hours of the morning, fires burned across Kabul. The cantonment, though fortified, had become an island of desperation amid a sea of rebellion. Officers wrote frantic messages to London, detailing attacks, desertions, and the near collapse of the city. They begged for reinforcements, for guidance, for hope. But the storm they had ignored for months was already upon them. Kabul's uprising had begun with the death of one officer, and now it consumed the city like wildfire. And in the silent, snow-covered hills surrounding Kabul, the tribes watched. They had acted with precision, exploiting British overconfidence and ignorance. The revolt had been swift, lethal, and merciless. Fires lit the night sky, musket smoke curled like a dark mist, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the cold air. The British realized, too late, that the city they thought they controlled had never belonged to them. Kabul had awakened, and once it did, no empire, no matter how powerful, could stop it. By dawn, the full weight of the uprising had been revealed. The cantonment was in flames, soldiers were scattered, and the streets were ruled by those who had lived in the mountains all their lives. The spark that began with the death of Lieutenant Martin had become an inferno, and there was no extinguishing it. Kabul had taken back its city, and the British were powerless to prevent it. The revolt would not be contained. It would not be forgotten. And as snow fell silently over the blood-soaked streets, a chilling truth settled over the cantonment. The occupation had failed, and what remained was the beginning of a long, deadly retreat that would haunt every man who survived, if any survived at all. Dawn barely broke over Kabul, and yet the cantonment already felt smaller than the day before. Smoke from fires still smoldered in the streets, curling into the pale winter sky. The once proud buildings that had housed officers and soldiers were scarred, doors splintered, windows shattered. Inside, the surviving British troops moved like shadows, stiff with cold, exhaustion, and fear. The city they thought they controlled had become a trap, and every heartbeat carried the weight of betrayal. In the space between walls and alleys, trust, once assumed, had vanished, leaving only suspicion and dread. The officers gathered quickly in the largest surviving tent, its canvas stiff with frost. Maps were spread across the table, but they meant little in the chaos that surrounded them. Messages from Afghan leaders lay in neat piles, marked with sharp commands, veiled threats, and demands that tested the limits of British patience. Promises of safe passage, of cooperation, of negotiation. Each one twisted upon delivery into deception, each word carrying the potential for death. Trust was no longer a shield. It had become a trap. Outside, the snow glistened deceptively, masking broken streets littered with debris, the bodies of soldiers and camp followers, and the remains of once prized supplies. Each footstep across it carried uncertainty. Who could be trusted? The sepoys? Some had deserted, disappearing into the hills with weapons and ammunition. The locals who had once offered tea and blankets now watched from hidden vantage points, eyes bright with suspicion or hatred. Even those who remained within the camp moved cautiously, unwilling to look each other in the eye, as if suspicion itself might betray them. Negotiations with Afghan leaders had become exercises in frustration. Envoys were sent to parley under flags of truce, carrying letters and promises from British officers who still believed in reason, in order, in honor. They returned either empty-handed or with news that hostages had been taken in exchange for compliance. The Afghans had mastered patience as a weapon, turning diplomacy into a game of death. For every promise made, a lie followed, and every assurance was layered with danger. The British could no longer tell friend from foe, and with each meeting, fear burrowed deeper into their minds. Inside the cantonment, fear spread like sickness. Soldiers whispered in corners about missing comrades, about traps set for those who ventured beyond the walls. Even officers, trained and disciplined, felt the creeping dread. Some tried to maintain control with strict orders, punishing hesitation or desertion. But order was fragile. Discipline had been replaced by panic, and panic is contagious. Every man who froze at a shout, everyone who doubted a command, further eroded the already thin line between survival and chaos. Families in the camp felt it too. Women and children huddled in makeshift shelters, listening to the cries and gunfire that still echoed from the city. Their eyes, wide with terror, reflected a world that had turned upside down. Mothers whispered prayers, husbands reassured silently, and children clung to whatever warmth remained. No promise of safety could reach them anymore. Even the strongest walls were nothing against deception and betrayal. Trust had fallen, and with it, the fragile cocoon of protection around the camp followers. The British attempted to respond, sending patrols into the city to gauge the situation. But every step outside the safety of the cantonment was a gamble. Afghans lay in wait, striking from rooftops and alleys. Patrols returned late, some not at all, leaving questions and fear in their wake. Every encounter that ended with survival reinforced the reality. Kabul was no longer theirs. It had become a landscape of suspicion, and every shadow might hold a rifle aimed at a soldier's chest. The British had trained to fight battles of strategy and formation. This was chaos, and chaos recognizes no rank, no uniform, no honor. Within the walls, officers grew increasingly desperate. Letters from London promised reinforcements and guidance, but the distance made any aid irrelevant. Every man understood that survival would not come from orders but from wit, courage, and luck. Plans were drawn, crossed out, redrawn, every scheme more impossible than the last. The snow outside reflected the cold truth. They were trapped in a city of enemies, and the ground beneath them offered no mercy. Every building was a potential trap, every messenger a possible spy. Afghan tactics were subtle, deadly, and precise. Rumors spread of small groups entering the camp under the guise of truce, only to vanish with weapons or captives. Supply wagons sent out never returned. Those brave enough to venture into the city sometimes came back with news of entire districts burned, others reduced to rubble. The British realized the full scale of deception. They had been negotiating with ghosts, promises, and carefully calculated lies designed to manipulate fear. Every conversation, every treaty, every attempt at diplomacy now carried a hidden threat. By midday, the air in the cantonment was thick with tension. Soldiers watched from towers, scanning the hills and streets, but there was nothing to see. Only the silent, waiting threat of ambush. Afghans moved unseen, blending into the snow and shadows. Every patrol became a test of nerves, every encounter a reminder that the British could no longer trust anyone outside their walls. And within, even trust between men had begun to crumble. Accusations of cowardice and betrayal passed silently from one officer to another. Whispers of treachery, of desertion, spread faster than news from the city streets. In one small tent, a group of officers huddled over a map, their faces pale and drawn. The discussion turned into shouting, then silence, then despair. No decision seemed right. Retreat would mean facing the mountains and the hostile tribes outside. To stay meant certain death from an insurgent city that now held all the power. To fight was to gamble with hopeless odds. Each officer felt the walls closing in, the snow pressing in from outside, the uncertainty pressing in from within. Trust, the glue that held armies together, had disintegrated. Without it, order itself seemed impossible. As night fell again, the city outside the cantonment hummed with life. Not the ordinary life of markets and laughter, but the tense, deadly life of insurgents, spies, and those who waited to strike. Fires illuminated the streets in a flickering red, reflecting off walls scarred by gunfire. From the hills, figures moved silently, observing, calculating. Kabul had become a city of traps, of suspicion, of betrayal, and the British understood that the walls they relied upon were no shield against the deception outside or the fear inside. Families huddled together, soldiers whispered into the dark, officers argued, and the snow fell silently over a city where trust had died. The cantonment, once a symbol of authority and order, had become a fragile cage, each man trapped by fear, deception, and the growing certainty of doom. In the silence of the night, the truth settled over every soldier and officer. The occupation had failed, and survival now depended on navigating a world where no promise could be believed, where no man could be trusted, and where every choice might be the last. By the end of the fourth day, the fall of trust had completed its grim work. Kabul city streets were no longer merely hostile. They were weaponized, each alley, each rooftop, each shadow part of a larger plan that the British could neither see nor counter. Inside the cantonment, fear had become tangible, almost physical, pressing against chests, stiffening limbs, and clouding judgment. The British soldiers understood that the war they were fighting was no longer against an enemy they could see. It was against suspicion, deceit, and the very idea that they could still survive in a city that had turned on them completely. The fall of trust was complete, and with it came the first true realization. The retreat from Kabul would not be a simple march to safety. It would be a journey into chaos, into snow, into death, where betrayal awaited at every step. The city had spoken. The British had listened too late. And in that cold, frozen dawn, fear became the master of all who remained in Kabul. Night had fallen over Kabul once more, and the cantonment was a place of quiet dread. Fires flickered along the broken walls, casting long, trembling shadows over soldiers huddled in the cold. Snow, once soft and silent, had turned into ice underfoot, making every step a reminder of fragility. Inside the largest surviving tent, dimly lit by a single lamp, British officers gathered for what would become the last council. The final meeting before choices that could mean life or death had to be made. The air was thick with smoke, the smell of unwashed men, and the oppressive weight of inevitability. Each man knew that the decisions discussed here would echo far beyond these canvas walls. Maps lay spread across a rough table, corners curled and stained with ink and frost. The officers traced their fingers over the roads leading out of Kabul, over the mountains and passes that promised either salvation or annihilation. Silence filled the gaps between them, broken only by the scratching of quills on paper or the creaking of boots on frozen ground. Each officer stared at the others, eyes wide with exhaustion and doubt. Pride and fear collided in that tent, twisting every suggestion, every word, into an agonizing decision. They had trained for battle, for conquest, for strategy. Not for the unraveling of an entire city, nor for the betrayal of promises they had once believed unbreakable. The first to speak was General Elphinstone, his voice low but carrying the weight of command. "We cannot remain here," he said, pointing to the map. "Supplies are dwindling. Morale is at its end. The city does not obey us. And if we wait, the Afghans will surround us completely." His hands shook slightly as he gestured, the lamplight catching the sweat on his brow. Around the table, officers nodded silently, though some clutched their swords tighter, as if the steel itself could hold back the rising tide of fear. Arguments began almost immediately. One officer, young and fiery, insisted that they should fight, that retreat would be seen as weakness, that honor demanded they hold the cantonment at all costs. His voice rose, cracking under the strain of desperation. He pointed to Kabul on the map, to the streets where smoke still curled, to the rooftops where enemies waited unseen. He argued that the army could regroup, that the Afghans would scatter if confronted with discipline and firepower. But for every point he made, the evidence outside the tent whispered a brutal truth. Kabul had already decided the outcome. Discipline would not be enough. Firepower could not reach every shadow. And every street had become a trap. Another officer spoke softly, almost reluctantly. He suggested negotiation, appealing to tribal leaders, promising concessions, hoping that diplomacy could buy them time or safe passage. His hands trembled as he folded and unfolded letters from Afghan chiefs. But the room responded with skepticism, anger, and grim acknowledgement. The city had already proven that words were weapons as sharp as swords. Every promise, every envoy, every flag of truce had been twisted into deception. Negotiation might only delay the inevitable, and delay could cost lives faster than bullets or snow. Fear thickened with each passing minute. Officers whispered of spies, of deserters, of patrols that had vanished into the night. Every report seemed worse than the last. Families missing, supply wagons stolen, soldiers lost in the alleys of Kabul. Pride battled survival instinct, a struggle that filled the tent with tension so dense it felt as if the canvas walls themselves might crack. No man spoke of retreat openly at first, because to suggest withdrawal was to admit failure, and failure was a shadow heavier than death itself. But as the night deepened, as the lamp flickered and burned low, the truth became undeniable. The cantonment could not withstand the city, and the city would not allow them to remain. A grim silence fell over the officers as they considered what retreat would mean. It was not simply walking away. It was marching through mountains in the dead of winter, facing hostile tribes at every turn, carrying wounded men, women, and children in a landscape that had already shown itself merciless. Each choice, fight, negotiate, or flee, seemed equally lethal. And in that frozen, lamplit tent, the weight of those choices pressed on every chest. Eventually, General Elphinstone spoke again, his voice heavier, quieter. "We march," he said simply. "It is the only course that leaves a chance, however small, for survival." Heads nodded slowly, but no relief followed. Fear remained. Pride remained. And the men understood that marching would not be a glorious retreat. It would be a desperate crawl through death itself, a journey measured in snow, blood, and the broken cries of those they could not save. They were not leaving a city. They were entering a graveyard of their own making. Orders were given. Units were assigned. Officers were tasked with keeping discipline, maintaining order, and preparing for a journey no one could hope to survive without losing something precious along the way. Families and camp followers were informed, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. Children clung to mothers, mothers to fathers, fathers to each other, hoping against reason that the journey would not take everything. But everyone understood, without needing to say it aloud. The road ahead was already carved in ice and blood. Outside, the wind whipped through the cantonment, carrying snow and whispers from the surrounding mountains. Afghan figures could be glimpsed on ridges and rooftops, observing, waiting, calculating. The retreat would not be unopposed. Every step forward would invite violence. Every shadow might conceal a rifle, a trap, or death. Even as the officers finalized their plans, the enemy seemed to smile silently from the snow-covered heights, patient, precise, and relentless. That night, the officers could not sleep. Some paced the length of their tents, muttering prayers or curses. Others stared at maps, tracing possible routes again and again with trembling fingers. Each man wrestled with his own fear and guilt, wondering which decisions would save lives and which would seal them. Pride and survival were locked in a battle as brutal as any fight in the streets. And above it all, the quiet, bitter knowledge settled. The army that had entered Kabul in confidence was leaving into uncertainty, and the mountains, the snow, and the city itself would decide their fate. By the early hours of morning, the council had dispersed. Officers returned to their commands, soldiers prepared the camp, and families huddled as best they could against the cold. The orders were clear. The march would begin at first light. There would be no turning back. And yet, as the snow drifted over the cantonment and the wind howled through shattered streets, fear remained. It was not a fear that could be erased with orders or discipline. It was a fear that had settled deep into the bones, the kind that whispered in the silence and followed every man into the mountains. The last council had spoken, and the path was chosen. But no strategy could protect them from the chaos that awaited, from the betrayals that had already been set in motion, from the brutal winter that lay ahead. Every soldier, every officer, every camp follower carried the weight of knowledge. The road home would be measured in snow and blood, and many would never see it. The decision had been made, but survival remained a question that even the most disciplined men could not answer. As dawn approached, casting pale light over a cantonment readying for a journey into the unknown, the officers could only hope that courage, discipline, and sheer luck would be enough to carry them forward. They would march because there was no other choice. They would step into the mountains, into the snow, and into the waiting arms of a world that had already turned against them. And as the first winds of morning swept through the frozen streets, a quiet, dreadful truth settled on all. The march from Kabul would not merely test their bodies. It would strip away every shred of pride, trust, and hope, leaving only the desperate struggle to survive. The last council had ended. The retreat had begun, and the mountains waited, silent and patient, for the British to stumble into the abyss. January 6, 1842, dawned cold and gray over Kabul. Snow clung to rooftops, drifting in the streets like the remnants of a world already dead. The British cantonment was silent, save for the rustling of boots over frozen ground, the soft cries of children, and the low, tense murmurs of soldiers preparing for a journey none could yet imagine surviving. The retreat had begun. 16,500 men, women, and children stepped cautiously into the white abyss, leaving behind the city that had turned against them, into mountains that seemed to stare down with indifferent cruelty. The first steps were tentative, measured. Officers rode at the head of the column, their faces pale beneath fur-lined hats. Soldiers trudged through snow that quickly swallowed footprints, hiding paths and erasing progress. Camp followers, families, wounded men, and those who had survived the first days of rebellion, followed behind, wrapped in blankets and cloaks, faces pressed against the wind and the blinding whiteness. Every breath produced clouds that froze on their lips. Every step was laborious, and every glance to the hills revealed a landscape both majestic and merciless. The mountains had no mercy, no allegiance. They simply watched, patient and unyielding. Within hours, the first attacks came. From ridges above the road, shadows moved with lethal precision. Musket fire shattered the brittle silence, striking soldiers and camp followers alike. Horses stumbled, sleighs toppled, and panic rippled through the column. Soldiers tried to form ranks, to protect the wagons and families, but the snow turned the narrow roads into treacherous traps. Every bend in the path, every pass between the mountains, became a killing ground. Afghans attacked with intimate knowledge of the terrain, striking where the British least expected and disappearing before any retaliation could be mounted. Families screamed as their loved ones fell. Mothers clutched children to their chests, shielding them from bullets and shrapnel. Fathers dragged wounded comrades through snow drifts, faces red and raw from wind and cold, lungs burning. The cries of the dying mixed with the howling wind, creating a symphony of desperation that filled the mountains. Soldiers tried to maintain order, shouting commands over the cacophony, but every step forward demanded sacrifice. Those who stumbled or lagged behind vanished into the snow, leaving only silence and the faint imprint of footprints in white powder. Food and water were scarce, and the cold gnawed at exposed skin like invisible teeth. Fingers and toes turned blue and stiff, muscles cramped, and exhaustion crept into every joint. Horses, once strong and reliable, faltered in deep drifts, their breath visible in icy clouds. The wounded cried, the sick moaned, and the healthy struggled to lift their eyes from the frozen landscape ahead. Every man and woman understood that this was no ordinary march. It was a fight against nature itself, a battle where snow and ice were as deadly as bullets or blades. The Afghans did not relent. They struck in waves, riding from hidden paths, firing from cliffs, and retreating into the whiteness like ghosts. The British columns, already fragile, began to splinter. Small units became isolated. Officers fought to maintain control over men who were terrified, exhausted, and hungry. Wagons carrying supplies overturned, leaving precious food and ammunition scattered across the snow. Every loss was felt immediately. Every death a reminder that survival depended not on courage alone but on chance, skill, and endurance. Even the landscape betrayed them. Narrow passes twisted and turned unpredictably. Cliffs loomed overhead, and sudden drops could claim a man or horse in an instant. Visibility was poor. Wind-driven snow erased landmarks, making the journey disorienting. Officers shouted directions, tried to marshal stragglers, and encouraged the wounded, but the weight of the mountains pressed down, relentless and unmoved by human effort. Each hour in the white abyss felt like a lifetime, and each step forward was a gamble with death as the dealer. Amid the chaos, some soldiers performed acts of extraordinary courage. One man lifted a child over a snow drift to shield her from gunfire. Another carried a wounded comrade across a narrow pass as bullets whistled past. Officers helped families onto sleds, and men fired their last cartridges to protect the column's rear. Yet for every act of bravery, countless others were lost. Each bullet found a target. Each slip on the ice left bodies frozen where they fell. The march was measured not in distance but in lives claimed by snow, gunfire, and despair. The wind howled like a living thing, cutting through clothes and armor, stealing warmth and blinding eyes. Snowdrifts rose over knees and sometimes over shoulders, trapping men and animals alike. Every attempt to rest was a risk. Every pause could invite attack. Hunger gnawed at the strongest stomachs, thirst burned like fire, and the cold hardened bones beyond endurance. The column moved forward, not because hope was alive, but because there was no other option. Standing still meant certain death. By midday, chaos reigned. Soldiers shouted for stragglers. Mothers screamed for children. Officers tried to rally units. And yet the Afghans continued to strike from every unseen vantage point. Musket fire and the whinny of frightened horses echoed against snow-clad peaks. Men fell silently, their bodies swallowed by snow, never to be found. The retreat had become a war against both the enemy and the environment, a slow-motion slaughter where courage often ended in futility. The families who followed carried only what they could: blankets, small supplies, and whatever meager possessions remained were clutched desperately. Children cried, some from cold, some from hunger, some from terror. Mothers' hands shook as they held them. Fathers' faces were pale from exhaustion. Those who lagged behind were lost to the snow, disappearing into drifts that seemed to grow larger with each passing hour. Every step was a test of endurance, every breath a battle, every glance over a shoulder a reminder of relentless pursuit. By late afternoon, the column reached a narrow pass that twisted like a frozen serpent through the mountains. Afghans appeared on ridges above, firing down with deadly accuracy. Panic surged through the ranks. Horses bolted, wagons overturned, and soldiers scrambled for cover in drifts that offered little protection. Every attempt to form a defensive line collapsed under fire and snow. The mountains themselves seemed to mock the British, indifferent to suffering, indifferent to lives lost. The retreat was no longer a movement. It was a march through a battlefield shaped by nature and revenge. Night fell again, and the cold became unbearable. Exhausted men huddled together, holding blankets over their heads, trying to protect themselves and the families with them. Fires were impossible. Smoke would draw enemy attention. The snow, already waist-deep in places, continued to fall, covering the bodies of the dead and hiding paths forward. Officers whispered over maps by lantern light, their faces pale and drawn, knowing the march must continue at dawn. The white abyss showed no mercy, no reprieve, no comfort. Only the relentless passage of snow and wind and death. And so, the first day of the retreat ended not with triumph, not with strategy, not with hope, but with exhaustion, grief, and fear. 16,500 souls had stepped into the snow that morning, and by nightfall the snow had claimed many. The Afghans had struck with precision. The cold had eaten at flesh and resolve, and the retreat had revealed its merciless nature. The British understood then, with icy clarity, that survival would demand more than courage. It would demand endurance, luck, and the impossible. The white abyss had begun to swallow Kabul's army. The march was no longer a retreat. It was a test of humanity itself. Every heartbeat, every step, every breath became a struggle. And as the wind howled across the mountains and snow buried the traces of those who had fallen, the British knew that the journey ahead would be measured not in miles, but in lives, and that the mountains were patient, merciless judges of all who dared to cross them. The morning of January 7th broke cold and gray over the mountains surrounding Kabul. Snow stretched as far as the eye could see, an unbroken white that hid every danger beneath its beauty. The British column, battered and exhausted from the previous day, moved slowly through a narrow mountain pass known as the Kabul route, a twisting path flanked by sheer cliffs on one side and deep ravines on the other. The soldiers knew instinctively that once they entered this corridor, there would be no turning back. Every man sensed the danger lurking above, in the cliffs and ridges where Afghan warriors waited patiently, like wolves poised to strike. Gunfire erupted without warning. The first volley came from the ridges above, where Afghans had concealed themselves among rocks and snowdrifts. Bullets tore through the column, and men fell silently, swallowed by the icy earth. Horses screamed and bolted, wagons overturned, and panic swept through the ranks like wildfire. Officers shouted orders, but the snow muffled voices, and the noise of gunfire drowned commands. Men tried to form lines, to defend the wounded and the families who followed behind, but the narrow path offered no room for formation, only death. Every step forward became a gamble. Soldiers stumbled in deep snow, their feet slipping on ice hidden beneath the powder. The wounded were dragged through drifts that reached to their knees, some too weak to rise, left behind with only the wind as witness. Families pressed forward, clutching children, their faces frozen in terror and exhaustion. Every cry echoed against the cliffs, mingling with the whinnying of terrified horses, creating a symphony of fear that the mountains swallowed greedily. There was no safety, only the relentless advance into a corridor that seemed designed for annihilation. The Afghans moved with precision, striking from multiple angles, disappearing into the snow before British volleys could respond. They rode along ridges, shot from behind rocks, and used the terrain to magnify every mistake, every hesitation. The column stretched impossibly long, straining to maintain cohesion while under constant attack. Men fired blindly, exhausted and terrified, but every shot seemed to provoke a calculated response from enemies who knew the mountains better than anyone ever could. The soldiers realized with grim clarity that the pass had become a death trap, and there was no escape from the forces above and around them. Snow turned red with blood as the first wave of casualties fell. The cries of the dying mixed with the wind, creating a soundscape of despair that seemed almost alive. Officers tried desperately to rally the men, to protect the wagons carrying families and supplies, but the column fragmented. Small groups became isolated, vulnerable to the relentless assault. The snow, already deep, became a grave, concealing bodies and footprints alike. Every step forward was a step into danger, and every glance over a shoulder revealed more enemies waiting, patient and unmoved by pleas or surrender. Horses, once the lifeblood of the army's mobility, faltered and fell into hidden crevices. Men tried to lift wounded comrades over icy drifts while bullets tore through the air. Camp followers tripped, fell, and disappeared into drifts or ravines, their cries cut short by the wind. Families who had survived the city now faced the mountains, and the mountains demanded tribute in blood. Hunger gnawed at the living, cold stiffened muscles, and exhaustion made each step heavier than the last. Survival became a fragile hope, threatened with every breath. Officers witnessed horror with growing helplessness. Every decision seemed futile. To advance was to invite death. To halt was to be overwhelmed. They shouted orders, waved swords, and tried to inspire courage, but even the bravest men trembled. The narrow pass left no room for tactical maneuvering, only for endurance against both enemy and environment. Soldiers slipped into snowdrifts, disappearing from view, leaving only empty footprints behind. Every man understood that the pass was not merely a path. It was a test, a trial designed to strip life, hope, and sanity from all who attempted it. By midday, chaos had reached its peak. Wagons were abandoned, supplies lost to the snow, and horses dead or panicked. Those who could walk did so with hands frozen, muscles screaming in agony, minds numbed by fear. Families huddled together, clinging to each other for warmth, for courage, for hope. Every cry of the wounded, every scream of a child, every metallic echo of a rifle shot seemed to blend into a nightmare that the mountains had composed, and the British soldiers marched on, step by excruciating step, into the trap from which there would be no escape. Afghan sharpshooters were relentless. They struck from unseen positions, taking advantage of every moment of hesitation. Even officers fell, their bodies swallowed by drifts or hidden among rocks. Men tried to protect one another, to maintain a semblance of order, but the attack was surgical, relentless, and merciless. The snow amplified the chaos, hiding ambushes, masking movements, and making every attempt at defense as fragile as ice. The pass had become a corridor of death, a crucible where only the strongest, fastest, or luckiest could survive. The column grew thinner with each hour. Soldiers whispered prayers or curses, clutching muskets until their hands bled. Families leaned on one another, shivering, crying, and stumbling over the bodies of the fallen. Horses that had survived so far collapsed under the strain, dragging men or wagons with them. The wounded could not keep pace. The cold and exhaustion claimed them as surely as bullets. Every man knew that the pass had no mercy, that retreat itself had become a battlefield of relentless suffering. By late afternoon, the narrow corridor seemed endless. Snow piled higher, wind cut deeper, and every ridge appeared to hide another group of Afghans, waiting for the slightest hesitation. Officers tried to regroup, to inspire courage, to find a safe path through the mountains, but every attempt was met with gunfire, falling rocks, and the relentless pressure of a determined enemy. The British realized with bitter clarity that the pass was not merely a passage. It was a judgment, and the mountains had already decided their fate. Families, soldiers, and camp followers pressed onward, some crawling, some stumbling, some falling forever into snowdrifts. Every step forward was a negotiation with death itself. Hunger, cold, and fear had replaced morale and discipline. Those who survived the morning might not survive the afternoon. And yet, despite the slaughter and the despair, the column pressed forward, bound by the instinct to survive, the orders of officers, and the faint hope that the mountains might eventually relent. As night fell, the survivors of the day's march huddled in small groups wherever shelter could be found, behind rocks, in shallow depressions, under abandoned wagons. Fires were impossible. Smoke would invite more attacks. The snow, now deep and blinding, concealed the bodies of those already claimed. Officers made quiet plans for the next day, knowing that dawn would bring more attacks, more snow, more death. The pass had no mercy, and the British understood that it might claim them all. The pass of no return had earned its name. Once entered, there was no turning back, no path to safety, only the relentless grind of survival against snow, mountains, and an enemy who knew the terrain as intimately as they knew their own hearts. Every man in the column understood the bitter truth. They were trapped in a corridor of death, and each step forward would require courage, endurance, and a touch of luck, the very things that were already stretched to their breaking point. By the end of the day, the mountains stood silent above the column, watching the blood and snow, indifferent to suffering. Every soldier and camp follower who survived understood that the retreat had become a journey into an abyss from which few would ever return. The pass of no return had taken its toll, and the survivors carried not only their wounds and exhaustion, but the growing realization that the retreat from Kabul was no longer a movement. It was a march through a frozen graveyard, and death waited patiently for every misstep. The morning after the horrors of the Kabul Pass dawned gray and merciless. Snow fell steadily, blanketing the already treacherous paths in silent white, as if trying to hide the traces of the dead from the living. The retreating British column pressed onward, but hope had grown thin, like the tattered cloaks wrapped around frozen shoulders. Every man understood that the mountains had claimed what they could, but now another, more insidious threat awaited them: betrayal. The Afghans had feigned truce, and those who trusted the promises were about to learn that deceit could kill as surely as musket fire. A small party of officers had been sent ahead to negotiate passage through the next pass, under assurances that local leaders would provide guides and protection. Wrapped in blankets and mounted on exhausted horses, they rode through snow-drifted ridges, expecting the faint possibility of mercy. But the messages of cooperation were hollow. The flags of truce were lies. As the officers entered the designated meeting point, the Afghans who should have offered guidance were gone, vanished as if swallowed by the white mountains themselves. In the distance, rifle shots cracked sharply through the still air. Panic rippled back through the column. The guides who had been promised did not appear. Those soldiers who had clung to the hope of local assistance were forced to make the impossible choice: wait and freeze, or continue blindly into terrain that promised nothing but death. Horses skidded on ice, wagons toppled, and soldiers struggled to maintain order. The snow, thick and unyielding, made every step perilous. Officers tried to reorganize units, to inspire courage in men already hollowed by fear, but whispers spread quickly that the truce was a trap, and despair deepened like frost creeping into bones. Trust had been shattered entirely. Units that had survived the earlier attacks now found themselves isolated. Families huddled together, unsure of which soldiers to follow, unsure if any path would lead to safety. The Afghans emerged from the hills and ridges with uncanny timing, attacking columns that had paused to regroup, cutting them off, forcing soldiers into deep snow where movement was impossible. Bullets tore through frozen air, claiming men and animals alike. Every attempt to advance seemed punished, every hesitation fatal. The betrayal was not just in empty promises. It was in the way the landscape itself conspired with enemies to snuff out life. Even those who tried to help each other found their efforts thwarted. Guides who had promised safety were nowhere to be found. Soldiers tried to lead families through alternate paths, only to find themselves blocked by hidden ridges and ambushes. The Afghans struck with brutal efficiency, knowing that every misstep by the British column was an opportunity. Wagons carrying supplies disappeared into snow drifts or were captured, leaving the survivors with barely enough food or ammunition to continue. Hunger gnawed at stomachs already weakened by cold, exhaustion, and fear, while the wind stole heat from every exposed limb. Children cried through the drifting snow, mothers' voices broken, fathers' faces etched with despair. Some attempted to carry the wounded, only to stumble and fall into drifts, never to rise again. Soldiers shouted for order, for calm, for courage, but the column was no longer an army. It was a collection of desperate souls struggling to survive. Even officers who had trained for years found their authority undermined by the freezing landscape and the treachery that had left them blind to every safe path. The retreat had become a nightmare that could not be navigated by discipline alone. As the day wore on, Afghans continued their relentless harassment. Men rode alongside cliffs, firing down into the narrow corridors. Snow obscured visibility, turning every ridge, every hollow, into a potential ambush. The British had begun to rely on the possibility of safe guidance, and the betrayal of that promise made each step more dangerous than the last. Whispers of treachery spread among the soldiers. "The guides have abandoned us," one man muttered, his face frozen and drawn. "We are alone, alone in the mountains." Fear, already deep, transformed into a palpable force, pressing on minds and bodies alike. By midday, the column had fractured into smaller groups, each moving as best it could. The snow hid bodies of those who had fallen, erased tracks, and amplified every misstep. Soldiers stumbled over their comrades, over abandoned wagons, over the dead, moving forward with exhaustion and terror etched into every line of their faces. Families clung together, shielding children, carrying what meager possessions remained. Every step felt like betrayal, not only from the Afghans, but from the mountains, the cold, and the cruel realization that no help would come. The betrayal became complete when units that had trusted supposed allies found themselves surrounded. Those who had believed in guidance were trapped in snowed-in corridors, rifles useless against attackers hidden in higher ground. Panic spread. Men fired wildly, trying to reach enemies they could not see. Horses reared and bolted, dragging men into drifts or off cliffs. Families screamed, some falling into snow to be claimed by the cold. The Afghans struck swiftly, silently, and disappeared just as quickly. The white landscape became a stage for death, and betrayal was its cruelest actor. By late afternoon, survivors huddled in makeshift shelters, behind rocks or fallen wagons, catching breath and trying to count the living. Each group realized the same truth. Those who had promised safety were gone, those who could have helped had abandoned them, and the march had become a journey of isolation. Hunger bit like a living thing, cold stiffened limbs beyond recognition, and fear gnawed relentlessly at minds already frayed by the snow and blood. The betrayal of trust had made the mountains even deadlier, and each step forward demanded more courage than could be measured in any man. Officers whispered plans, knowing that each decision could mean life or death. The Afghans watched, patient and cunning, as the British column struggled to maintain cohesion. Units that tried to regroup were attacked again, while those who advanced blindly were picked off by sharpshooters. The snow-covered landscape, once thought neutral, now seemed complicit, concealing ambushes, erasing paths, and hiding bodies. Every man understood that this betrayal was not just tactical, it was total, consuming hope itself. Families, soldiers, and camp followers pressed on as best they could, shivering, starving, exhausted, and terrified. Children whimpered, mothers whispered prayers, and soldiers carried weapons heavier than their bodies could endure. The retreat was no longer a march. It was a funeral procession, moving slowly forward through snow, wind, and the betrayal of every promise they had trusted. The Afghans, patient and ruthless, struck again and again, leaving death as the only constant. Night fell, bringing no relief. The survivors huddled in whatever shelter they could find. Rocks, ravines, overturned wagons, knowing that dawn would bring more snow, more attacks, and more death. The betrayal of guides, allies, and promises was complete. Trust had died, and only survival remained. The British had entered the mountains with hope, discipline, and pride, but the treachery they encountered had stripped them bare. The snow concealed the living and the dead alike, erasing distinction, leaving only a desperate struggle to continue. By the end of the day, the retreating column had been reduced further, not only by bullets and knives but by the betrayal that left them vulnerable, hungry, and exposed. Each step forward demanded courage, endurance, and the impossible hope that the snow would somehow relent, that the Afghans would pause, that survival might be possible. But the betrayal was complete. The cold was merciless, and the march through the frozen mountains promised nothing but continued suffering and death. The snow fell endlessly over the survivors, muffling cries, covering footprints, and hiding the corpses of those already claimed. Families clutched children, soldiers clutched weapons, and officers clutched what remained of hope. But hope was fragile, and betrayal had shattered the illusions of safety. The column continued forward, step by painful step, into an unforgiving winter that had become their enemy as much as the Afghans themselves. In the frost, trust had died, and only survival, tentative, precarious, and fleeting, remained. The wind tore mercilessly through the mountain passes as the remnants of the British column pressed forward, their faces etched with exhaustion, terror, and despair. Snow fell thickly, covering every step in a soft, indifferent blanket that promised neither warmth nor mercy. Among the soldiers, officers, and camp followers, there were those who carried children, tiny bodies trembling against the cold, faces pale and lips blue. Mothers wrapped their arms around infants, whispering prayers, trying to shield them from the bullets that hissed through the air, the crunch of ice under hooves, and the merciless avalanche of frost that claimed the weak with quiet inevitability. The retreat was no longer an organized military maneuver. It had become a slow-moving funeral procession, where every step threatened death and every pause risked collapse. The children of the caravan were both the most vulnerable and the most haunting measure of the army's suffering. Small hands clutched the tattered garments of their parents. Little feet sank into snow drifts that swallowed them up, and the bitter wind stole breath with the cruel impartiality of a predator. Soldiers who had fought with courage against the Afghans now found themselves helpless, watching mothers collapse beside frozen corpses while children screamed for warmth and food that no one could provide. Starvation became a relentless companion. Wagons carrying what little supplies remained had been lost or destroyed in the previous day's ambushes. The snow hid everything, and every morsel of food that could be scavenged was quickly consumed. Children cried with hunger, their stomachs swollen, their cries piercing the cold mountain air. Mothers tried to share what little they had, offering small scraps of bread or morsels of dried meat, but often it was not enough. Some infants could not cry. They had already been silenced by frostbite, by hunger, by exhaustion. Their tiny bodies surrendered to the merciless winter. The Afghans continued to harass the column, striking from ridges and cliffs where no British soldier could reach. Every volley scattered soldiers and camp followers, sending children tumbling into snowdrifts. The cries of the wounded and terrified echoed endlessly through the valleys, swallowed only partially by the howling wind. Fathers lifted children over obstacles, tripped, and fell themselves, their lives claimed quietly by the mountains as much as by the bullets. Survival demanded movement, yet movement often led to more suffering, a cruel cycle with no reprieve. Families struggled to maintain cohesion, but the chaos of snow, gunfire, and exhaustion made unity almost impossible. Children clung desperately to their parents' skirts or sleeves, while some were lost entirely in the white haze, swallowed by drifts or dragged by panicked animals. Mothers called out in despair, searching through the snow and screaming for their children, but the wind carried their voices away. Officers and soldiers tried to protect the most vulnerable, lifting children over obstacles, shielding them with their bodies, but there were simply too many to save, and each act of bravery was measured against the harsh reality that some lives would inevitably be lost. Hypothermia claimed many faster than bullets ever could. Fingers, toes, and noses turned blue and stiff. Lips and ears bled from frostbite. Children who had begun the march with cries and laughter now whimpered weakly, their energy drained by cold and fear. Some could walk no longer, their parents dragging them through snow drifts that reached to their shoulders. The column moved forward not because of hope, but because the mountains allowed no pause, and because the snow buried any thought of turning back. Every step was agony, every breath a struggle, and every glance at a child's frozen face brought despair so deep it could shatter the hardest heart. Even the soldiers, hardened by years of training and battle, began to falter. Discipline eroded under the weight of the snow, hunger, and constant attacks. They carried wounded comrades, families, and children when they could, but their strength was fleeting. Horses faltered under the load, sometimes throwing the children from their backs into drifts of snow where survival was a cruel lottery. The Afghans observed from above, patient and precise, striking with deadly accuracy and disappearing before any counterattack could be mounted. The mountains, too, were enemies, icy, treacherous, and unmoving. As the day wore on, the retreat became a test not only of endurance but of the human spirit. Children shivered against the bodies of their parents, sobbed for warmth and food, and sometimes fell silent, their tiny hands frozen into fists against the snow. Mothers sang lullabies that no one could hear, fathers whispered promises that they could not keep, and soldiers cursed the day they had marched into this white abyss. The snow covered tracks and footprints, hiding both the living and the dead. Every step forward was a step into uncertainty, every pause a potential grave. The wounded and the dying were everywhere. Soldiers tried to lift them over drifts, mothers tried to shield children from gunfire, but for every life saved, several were lost. The cries of families echoed across valleys, a haunting chorus that blended with the whistle of wind and the crack of distant musket fire. The retreat was no longer about strategy or survival. It was a test of endurance against a landscape, an enemy, and a winter that showed no mercy. Those who fell behind were quickly lost to frost or ambush, leaving only silence where there had once been voices. The snowstorm worsened by afternoon, reducing visibility to a few paces. Children's small forms disappeared into the whiteness. Parents shouted in desperation, trying to keep them close, but the wind swallowed every sound. Soldiers formed human chains, grasping hands and shoulders to prevent stragglers from being claimed by the snow. But every link in the chain eventually weakened. Every parent understood that survival was uncertain, and every soldier realized that their duty had expanded beyond defense. It was now to carry, shield, and protect as many lives as possible, even at the cost of their own. As night fell, the remaining survivors huddled in clusters, pressed against rocks or fallen wagons, trying to keep children warm with blankets, fur, and their own bodies. Hunger gnawed at them relentlessly. The cold seeped into bones and muscles, leaving them numb and trembling. Some children had already succumbed to frostbite or exhaustion. Their small bodies stiffened in the snow, silent reminders of the retreat's relentless toll. The mountains around them were silent witnesses, patient and indifferent, as if they too understood that in this frozen world, only a few could endure. By the end of the day, the retreating column had lost many of its youngest and most vulnerable. The snow had claimed them as surely as bullets or blades. Families pressed forward in despair, soldiers carried what they could, and officers tried to maintain whatever order remained. Each step forward demanded courage, endurance, and sheer willpower, but the human cost was unbearable. The children of the caravan were both a symbol of hope and a measure of tragedy, their suffering echoing across the valleys like a haunting refrain. In the dark of night, huddled under rocks and sparse blankets, the survivors understood a grim truth. The retreat had become a funeral march, where survival was uncertain and every breath could be the last. Hunger, cold, and fear were constant companions. Betrayal and ambush haunted every step. The children, innocent and fragile, were the most poignant witnesses to the suffering, their small faces etched with pain and fatigue that no words could soothe. The march had become not merely a movement, but a test of human endurance, a slow journey through grief, snow, and despair. By dawn, The remaining column prepared to continue, the children still clinging to parents and soldiers alike. Each step forward would carry the weight of the fallen, the grief of the living, and the relentless reminder that survival had become a struggle against everything: nature, enemy, cold, and despair. The mountains loomed above, patient and unyielding, as the British pressed on, their caravan of suffering moving through a landscape that would claim the weak and spare no mercy. In the white abyss, the retreat had taken its most human toll yet, and every heartbeat was a defiance against the frozen, indifferent world. The morning light barely touched the hills surrounding Gandamak, a lonely ridge of rock and snow that now held the last remnants of the shattered British column. The retreating army had been reduced to a handful of starving, frostbitten men, women, and children, their faces hollow, eyes glassy, lips blue, fingers stiff with cold. The snow underfoot was trampled, blood-stained, and filled with the footprints of the dead. The survivors moved slowly, each step a monumental effort, aware that the Afghans watched from ridges and cliffs, waiting to finish what the mountains and winter had begun. By the time they reached Gandamak, the column had fractured into tiny groups. Soldiers huddled with families, weapons clutched in numb hands, faces frozen with exhaustion and terror. The wind cut through their cloaks, howling through the pass like a mournful cry. Some clung to hope, others to life itself, and a few whispered silent prayers to whatever God might be listening. Every heart knew what was coming. The ridge was narrow, exposed, and surrounded by enemy positions that allowed no escape. Death had been patient, and now it had arrived with purpose. The Afghans moved silently at first, circling the ridge with deadly patience. Sharpshooters perched on rocks, rifles trained on every cluster of survivors. Cavalry rode along distant ridges, cutting off potential escape routes. The British, weakened by days of snow, starvation, and attack, formed a desperate defensive line, their numbers so few that a single volley of gunfire could destroy them entirely. Officers tried to rally men, their voices hoarse, teeth chattering, bodies trembling. But the terror in the eyes of the survivors betrayed the hopelessness they all felt. Families clutched each other, children crying silently from cold and fear, soldiers whispering reassurances that none truly believed. The snow beneath them was trampled into a field of death, already littered with the corpses of comrades, camp followers, and animals. The smell of blood, mixed with the bitter tang of frost, clung to the air. Each breath felt stolen, each heartbeat fragile. The ridge of Gandamak, once just another part of the terrain, had become a stage for a tragedy so complete that it seemed to consume everything within its reach. The Afghans struck without warning. Musket fire erupted from ridges above, bullets whistling past ears, striking men and women alike. Soldiers fired back, but their aim was slow, their hands numb, and their numbers pitiful against the tide of attackers. Horses bolted, dragging soldiers and wagons into drifts of snow where the weak could not follow. The survivors fought not with courage but with instinct, gripping whatever weapons remained, trying to protect families and comrades with trembling arms. The ridge was chaos incarnate, a frozen arena where every man, woman, and child was both target and witness to a merciless slaughter. Bodies fell silently into snowdrifts, some half buried by wind before their comrades could react. Children screamed, mothers wept, and fathers cursed the cruel fate that had brought them here. Officers shouted orders over the din of gunfire, their voices hoarse, but the survivors could barely hear them. Every attempt at organization dissolved into instinctive survival. The Afghans moved like shadows, precise and patient, striking, withdrawing, and returning to claim any who stumbled. The ridge was alive with death, and there was no respite, no mercy, no possibility of retreat. As the sun rose higher, the slaughter continued. Each soldier understood that this would be their last stand. Ammunition was scarce, gunpowder dampened by snow and ice. Those who could no longer hold their rifles used bayonets or fists, fighting with a ferocity born not of hope but of desperation. Children clung to dying parents. Mothers tried to shield them with their own bodies, and soldiers pushed forward even as their limbs stiffened and hearts faltered. Every breath was a labor, every movement a risk, every glance over a shoulder a witness to the inevitability of death. The ridge narrowed further, and the survivors were forced into tight clusters, easy targets for sharpshooters and cavalry attacks. Horses screamed as they were cut down. Soldiers fell over comrades, families collapsed in the snow, and the Afghans pressed relentlessly. The ridge of Gandamak became a frozen crucible, concentrating every sorrow, every fear, every act of desperate courage into a single, unbearable moment. Some survivors fought with silent resignation, some with blind panic, but all understood that the end was near. By afternoon, the British numbers had dwindled to a few dozen, their strength sapped, their bodies raw from frostbite, starvation, and wounds. Officers tried to maintain morale, shouting encouragement, helping the wounded, carrying children over snowdrifts, but the avalanche of death was unstoppable. Every man knew that surrender was impossible. The Afghans offered none, and the ridge allowed no escape. The last stand had become inevitable, and every heartbeat brought the survivors closer to their final reckoning. Men fell around them, silently or with cries of pain, until the ridge seemed littered with corpses. Blood mingled with snow, creating a red and white mosaic that stretched to the horizon, a testament to the scale of the slaughter. Mothers clutched children as bullets tore through their ranks, soldiers pressed forward against impossible odds, and officers fell beside the wounded, their hands frozen around rifles, their faces pale and etched with grief. The last stand at Gandamak was not a battle. It was a funeral, slow, inescapable, and total. Some of the survivors tried to fight their way out, seeking cliffs or passes that might offer a chance of escape. But the Afghans anticipated every move, cutting off every path, pressing the survivors into the snow until all that remained was resistance without hope. The ridge itself seemed to collapse under the weight of death, the snow covering the bodies as if trying to conceal the scale of the tragedy. Every attempt at survival was met with violence, and every life that struggled to continue was another witness to the cruelty of fate and the mountains themselves. By evening, only a handful remained, officers, soldiers, and a few camp followers clinging to life through sheer will. They had fought until powder ran out, until rifles were useless, until their bodies could no longer move. They huddled together, shivering, silent, surrounded by the corpses of comrades and families, blood frozen on skin and clothing, snow blown across faces and hair. The Afghans observed from ridges above, patient, precise, and unrelenting. The last stand at Gandamak had ended not with victory, but with extinction. As night fell, the few survivors collapsed into the snow, too weak to rise, too exhausted to fight. The wind howled through the ridge like a requiem, carrying away cries, gunfire, and the last moments of life from those who remained. Children, too few to count, were cradled by dying mothers. Officers whispered encouragement that no one could hear. Every heartbeat was fragile, every breath uncertain, and every movement a defiance against an end that had already come. The ridge of Gandamak had claimed its toll, leaving behind a scene of devastation that would echo across history as one of the most complete and tragic annihilations of a military force ever recorded. By dawn, the survivors who could still move prepared to continue, though there were hardly enough left to form a line. Their strength was gone, their numbers decimated, and their hearts hollowed by grief. Gandamak stood silent behind them, a scar of red and white in the snow, a monument to courage, desperation, and the merciless inevitability of death. The last stand had ended. The march would continue, but the spirit of the army of Kabul had been broken, leaving only a few souls to carry the memory of the horror into the mountains beyond. The morning light filtered weakly through a gray sky over the desolate mountains, where snow lay deep and unbroken except for the frozen tracks of a few scattered survivors. The army of Kabul, once 16,500 strong, had been reduced to ghosts moving through an unmerciful winter. Among the scattered remnants of men, women, and children, there was no cohesion, no hope of rescue. The wind carried the silent screams of those long dead, and the snow muffled every sound of struggle, leaving only the eerie whisper of the mountains and the occasional crack of a rifle fired in desperation. It was into this frozen wasteland that a solitary figure emerged, riding slowly over the ridge toward Jalalabad. His horse, half dead with exhaustion, trudged through the snow, hooves sinking into drifts that reached to the animal's knees. The rider himself was a gaunt figure, wrapped in tattered blankets, face blue from frostbite, eyes hollow and fixed on the horizon. His name was Dr. William Brydon, the only man to make it from the decimated British column to the relative safety of Jalalabad. Every inch he moved told the story of the retreat in ways words could not capture. The pain, the terror, the relentless loss that had consumed thousands of men, women, and children. As he rode, the snow around him was silent but cruelly observant, covering the dead in its white shroud. Horses, wagons, and bodies of men and women were half buried, creating a landscape both serene and horrifying. Brydon's horse stumbled over the frozen corpses of those who had fallen in the previous day's chaos. He could see the remnants of officers' uniforms, torn and bloodied, and the frozen expressions of children still clutched in their mothers' arms. Every step forward was a reminder that he alone had survived a march that had claimed nearly everything else. The mountains behind him, silent and cold, had been the executioners. The narrow passes, the ambushes, the snowdrifts, and the betrayal of supposed allies had all conspired to reduce the army to near nothing. The Afghans had struck with precision, and the winter had shown no mercy. Yet it was not only nature and enemy that had destroyed the column. It was fear, hunger, and despair. Brydon's mind could scarcely comprehend the scale of the loss. Every face he had known in Kabul, every officer and soldier, every camp follower, had vanished into the snow, leaving only his lonely passage through the mountains. As he neared Jalalabad, the gates appeared faintly through the gray haze, a beacon of fragile hope. But even now, his journey was not complete. The snow was deep, the horse faltering, Brydon himself staggering in exhaustion, limbs stiff with frostbite and weakness. He had survived not because of strength, but because of will, a stubborn insistence to continue despite a world that had become death incarnate. Every breath was a labor, every heartbeat a victory over the cold and the despair that had claimed so many others. Along the way, he passed reminders of the retreat's horror. Frozen bodies of soldiers slumped over wagons, children half buried in snow, mothers clasping their lifeless infants. Wolves occasionally moved silently along ridges, scavenging, drawn by the scent of death. Brydon did not speak. His eyes absorbed what the mind could scarcely process. The retreat, with all its betrayal, ambushes, starvation, and frost, was written into the landscape itself. Every step of his horse imprinted a story of survival against odds so impossible they seemed like legend. The first guards at Jalalabad noticed him only as a shape emerging from the white, a spectral rider stumbling toward the gates. His horse, dripping sweat and blood from exhaustion, bore him slowly forward. Officers and soldiers ran to meet him, fear and confusion etched on their faces. Could this lone figure possibly be one of the column? Was he a ghost, a hallucination, a sign of the living dead? Brydon's entrance into the city was silent but unmistakable, a testament to the scale of the disaster that had befallen Kabul. When Brydon dismounted, the magnitude of the retreat became clear to everyone who saw him. His clothes were tattered, frozen in places, stained with blood, mud, and snow. His body bore the marks of frostbite and exhaustion, and his eyes reflected the memory of thousands who would never arrive. Children clutched at their parents in horror as soldiers tried to lead him inside. Brydon could scarcely speak. The story of the army of Kabul had been told before he opened his lips. The very sight of him communicated what words could not, that almost all had been lost, and survival was rare beyond measure. Officers pressed around him, offering blankets, food, and water, but his strength was fading. Brydon's mind wandered over the names of the men who had fallen beside him, the families who had perished, the officers whose faces he would never see again. Every detail of the retreat, the snow, the ambushes, the betrayal, the death, pressed into him, a weight that would never be lifted. The journey to Jalalabad was not merely a physical feat. It was a passage through unimaginable loss and horror, and Brydon carried the living memory of all who had died. Through Brydon, the survivors in Jalalabad understood the scale of the calamity. The retreat was no longer abstract or hidden in rumors. It had a face, a story, and a name. One man, alone, had emerged from the mountains to tell the tale, though his body and spirit were stretched to the breaking point. Every detail he carried, the snow, the blood, the families, the soldiers, the betrayals, was a reminder that the army of Kabul had been destroyed. The gates of Jalalabad became a stage where history revealed itself in a single, broken figure. Even as he recovered, Brydon's mind replayed the retreat. He remembered the mountains swallowing men, the Afghans' patient strikes from hidden ridges, the snow drifting over bodies, the children who had cried for food that never came. He remembered officers falling silently into drifts, mothers clutching infants through the night, and soldiers who had fought valiantly until strength gave out. Every memory was a wound, every breath a reminder that survival came at the cost of thousands of lives. The mountains behind him had witnessed it all. Jalalabad ahead was a fragile haven, temporary and incomplete. As Brydon sat by a fire, warming frostbitten limbs, he understood the truth. The army of Kabul no longer existed. What remained was the memory of their courage, their suffering, and their deaths. One man could not convey the totality of the horror, but his presence testified to every story untold, every life erased, every moment of terror endured in the frozen passes. His arrival at Jalalabad marked both an end and a beginning. The end of the army, the beginning of the story that would haunt the British Empire for decades. The mountains stood silent behind him, snow drifting endlessly, indifferent to survival or death. The Afghans had triumphed, the snow had claimed its toll, and only one man carried the living memory of all that had been lost. Brydon's journey would be told in whispers, letters, and official reports, but no account could capture fully the human suffering, the despair, or the scale of loss. The rider in the snow was a symbol, a ghostly witness, and a single voice echoing the tragedy of an empire brought to its knees by terrain, winter, and human resistance. Snow still drifts over the mountains of Afghanistan, covering the scars of what was once the proud British Army of Kabul. The land has long since healed, or perhaps forgotten, but the echoes of 1842 remain carved into history, whispered in letters, diaries, and the stories passed down through generations. The retreat from Kabul was not just a military disaster. It was a human tragedy of unimaginable scale, a lesson in hubris, betrayal, and the merciless weight of nature. The snow, once a silent witness to horror, has melted and frozen again countless times, but its memory lingers, immortal in the suffering it concealed. The British Empire, vast and seemingly invincible, felt the tremor of this defeat keenly. Back in London, reports trickled in slowly, each word more haunting than the last. The death of 16,499 men, women, and children was not just a statistic. It was a reckoning. Officers who had survived long enough to tell tales carried guilt that could not be erased. Families waited in vain for letters that would never arrive, and the empire itself had to confront a painful truth. Even the mightiest forces were fragile when faced with mountains, winter, and a determined enemy. Dr. William Brydon's lone arrival at Jalalabad became both symbol and warning, a ghostly emblem of what hubris could bring. The retreat echoed far beyond the borders of Afghanistan. Soldiers' letters spoke of the relentless snow, of comrades falling silent in the drifts, of mothers clasping children as the cold stole their warmth and their lives. The survivors remembered the betrayal of supposed allies, the patience of Afghan marksmen, and the inevitability of death pressing in from every direction. The empire had seen conquests and victories, but nothing had prepared it for the total human cost of the mountains of Kabul. The story was passed along quietly, often overshadowed by political ambitions and colonial pride, but it remained, stubborn and unyielding, in the memories of those who lived and those who died. In the valleys and passes of Afghanistan, the mountains reclaimed what had been theirs. Corpses, wagons, rifles, and the remnants of campfires disappeared under snowfall and time. The ridges that had claimed the British were indifferent to their presence, as they had been for centuries. The Afghans, proud and fiercely independent, had resisted occupation and emerged victorious, not through sheer numbers alone, but through knowledge, cunning, and intimate familiarity with the land. The snow covered every detail, leaving the retreat as much legend as history, yet its moral was clear. No empire could conquer these mountains without paying a terrible, inescapable price. The lessons of the retreat haunted those who survived. Officers and soldiers bore the weight of guilt, shame, and grief. They had marched into Kabul believing in their superiority, their discipline, and the authority of the empire, only to find themselves prey to a landscape, a climate, and a people that respected neither. Families mourned children lost to snowdrifts. Mothers wept for husbands who would never return, and entire communities were left to grapple with the absence of voices that had once filled their homes. The snow of Kabul was not merely a winter. It was a mirror reflecting the limits of human power and the enduring consequences of underestimating both nature and human resistance. Brydon's survival became emblematic, a single rider against the expanse of a frozen nightmare. He carried with him the faces of thousands, the memory of families broken, the echo of footsteps that would never reach home. The British who read his account shivered not only from the cold of the mountains but from the realization that even the most disciplined, well-armed forces could be annihilated when arrogance met the unforgiving winter and the cunning of a determined foe. History remembered him not as a hero in the conventional sense, but as the lone witness to an epic catastrophe, a living testament to the fragility of life in war and the inevitability of loss. The retreat's impact on the empire was profound. Policy shifted, military strategies were reconsidered, and commanders learned the brutal lesson that logistics, weather, and local knowledge could not be ignored. Yet the emotional cost was immeasurable, residing in the hollow eyes of returning survivors and in the families who awaited the letters that never arrived. For the British public, the news was shocking, a stark counterpoint to tales of conquest and empire. The frozen mountains of Kabul had humbled a nation, reminding it that even power could falter against nature, courage, and the will to resist. Across Afghanistan, the memory of the retreat remained vivid among tribes and communities. Oral histories recounted the Afghans' resilience, the ambushes in the snow, and the lessons taught by patient, calculated strikes. The mountains, indifferent and eternal, had reclaimed their own. The narrative of the frozen empire became both a cautionary tale and a point of pride, proof that an outsider, no matter how mighty, could be humbled by knowledge, terrain, and determination. The snow, the cold, the ridge at Gandamak, the cries of children, and the lone rider, all were woven into the fabric of Afghan memory, immortalizing a victory that required no grand monuments to commemorate. In the corridors of power, the story became a ghost haunting every decision about Afghanistan. Strategists and commanders pondered the limits of force, the consequences of ignoring local alliances, and the fragile nature of supply lines and human endurance. The retreat was cited in whispers and reports, in lectures and military manuals, but always with the shadow of its human cost. The empire could rebuild, armies could march again, but the images of snow-drifted corpses, the hollow eyes of dying children, and the memory of the lone rider would never fade. The tragedy was not only a lesson in military strategy, but a human story of suffering, endurance, and ultimate loss. Even today, historians return to the frozen passes of Kabul to examine the retreat. The mountains have not changed. The snow still falls, indifferent to human ambition. Yet the story remains compelling, a reminder of the human toll of imperial ambition. It is a story not just of defeat, but of endurance, courage, and the fragility of life when confronted with betrayal, nature, and the relentlessness of war. The retreat is studied, memorialized, and recounted, but its greatest lesson is simple and haunting. The cost of hubris, measured in blood and snow, is never forgotten by those who bear witness. The retreat from Kabul was more than a military disaster. It was a human catastrophe that resonates through time, a story of families torn apart, soldiers extinguished, and an empire forced to confront its own vulnerability. Dr. William Brydon's lone survival is remembered not as triumph, but as testament to what was endured, to what was lost, and to the fragility of life in the face of winter, betrayal, and battle. The echoes of the frozen empire linger still, in history books, in whispers, and in the shadow of the mountains that once swallowed an entire army. Snow continues to fall over the passes, softening the sharp edges of rocks and ridges, hiding the traces of those who perished. Yet the memory of the retreat endures, etched into human consciousness and into the legacy of empire. The army of Kabul may be gone, but its story is immortal, a reminder of courage and despair, of hope and hopelessness, of the costs of ambition and the limits of power. In the quiet of winter, among the silent ridges, the retreat remains alive, a frozen echo, calling out across time, insisting that history never forget the price paid by the living and the dead alike.